Over 20% of the land in our cities is dedicated to parking cars. Imagine the possibilities if that is no longer needed. Two planners leading the way in understanding the research of this is Jason Sudy and Rick Stein. Jason is a principal with me in the firm of OHM Advisors. Jason is a certified planner with 20 years of work in urban planning. He is an auxiliary faculty member of the Knowlton School of Architecture at The Ohio State University. He co-founded the Urban Mobility Research Center with Rick Stein in 2016. Rick is also a certified planner and owner of Urban Decision Group, an urban planning and analysis firm specializing in the utilization of technology to add to the planning process. You are in for a real treat today, as these two esteemed gentlemen will give you a glimpse into the future of our cities. So please give Jason and Rick a Rotary welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks for having us today. What we're going to do is talk to you about what we see as an absolutely inevitable technology. We are not hired by a car company or any other mobility company or anyone who has anything to do with this technology. So I want to make it very clear that we're not here to advocate for this technology. We're here to explain to you that it is going to happen. It's going to have fundamental consequences, both positive and negative, for our cities, for our built environments, ranging from individual sites through regions. That being said, I know some of you may be skeptical. And if any of you don't believe this is going to happen now and don't believe it after this presentation is over, you can pretend that you did 10 years later when we come back, and we will not say I told you so, because you're very simply absolutely wrong. And hopefully we will prove that to you in just a second. I'll let Rick talk a little bit more about himself in a second, but myself, Rick, and another gentleman named Justin Robbins, we've been working together for the last several years. And the reason we started this was because we were at a planning conference a few years back, and as urban planners, we're expected to think out ahead at least 10, if not 20, 30, 50 years in the future. And a gentleman who had been the mayor of Pittsburgh was there speaking, and he mentioned autonomous self-driving vehicles as one of the major driving change technologies in the near future. And around the room, the sound that was heard was like when you watch Parliament on C-SPAN, no one was believing it. They weren't buying it. About 3 or 4 of us looked around the room and caught each other's eyes and became pretty concerned with the fact that, as planners, the people who should be looking out in the future more than anyone else were not aware that this technology was really an inevitability. Now, a lot has happened in 2 years, and we'll show you some of those things. The belief level has risen substantially, so we're going to spend a little less time today trying to convince you it will happen and explain to you what we think will happen in the future. Is there anything else at this point, Rick?
Sure. I know there's some of you out there that know me, and if you know me and anything about my background, prior to getting into planning, I was a software developer, so I am a nerd of the first order. And so something like this is right up my alley. But I want to caution, as you're listening to this presentation, and we're talking about technology and all the possibilities, both the positive and negative, just keep in mind that we don't really have any concrete examples of technology solving all of our problems. As a matter of fact, we have a lot of evidence that it creates an awful lot of negative externalities or unintended consequences. So really, ultimately, as much as we plan on automating in the future as a society, it's really up to us humans to keep things in check and regulated as we move along. And with that,
okay, we're going to move through this fairly rapidly in order to make sure that we cover most of the information that is in the big picture about this, and then some specific information that may be of particular interest to you. So what is it all about? Just to take a quick moment to think back, look at a picture like this. Even though this does not look exactly like today's cities, it resembles what all humans of millennia would recognize of the basic building blocks of cities. It has some sort of thoroughfare. It has some sort of transportation device. It has buildings that are relatively close to that thoroughfare where people can easily walk back and forth and use different modes of transportation to access stores, places they live. And this goes back truly to ancient times, that even if cities didn't have a vehicle on them, they all functioned relatively similarly to this. And this is what we have in many, many of our areas today. we have the inevitability of having individuals and individual cars that they have to drive themselves and leave at different places where they are. For you to get around a city like Columbus, as much as you want to be urban and try to leave your car behind, it's extraordinarily difficult. That's the case for most of the United States. And so this is the end result of 70 years of us trying out this new experiment. So one of the things I'm going to impress upon you today, it seems like what we are proposing may radically transform things in a way that we've never seen. Well, that's because we've never seen them. And nobody in here is over 100 years old, to my eye, and most of us are quite a bit shy of that. So this isn't a new thing. What we're talking about is what has been the case for cities for millennia, and we've only changed that in 70 years. So now we have to figure out how that's going to alter. So as we end that 70-year experiment, the important thing for you to realize is some people will win and some people will lose, just like happens with every new technology. As Rick said, there are inevitabilities that we cannot foresee. In particular, different communities will win and lose. And those who are ready to adapt and embrace this technology will succeed where others may not. One advantage we have here in Columbus is that we have won the Smart City Challenge, which was a federal DOT program. We won $40 million with a $10 million match, and now we've had over $100 million in matching public money. Private money, rather, to supplement that public money. That's a great start, but that's only the beginning of the things that we may need to change in order to be ready for this.
Here's a quick little video. This is zipping through streets and, stopping at stop signs, obeying the speed limit, stopping for pedestrians, maneuvering just like any other car with a driver would do. And when it gets to the end, it stops and parks itself. And I can see that we will be here till 1 o'clock. So there's going to be 4 primary types of vehicles that are on the road once we experience cars that reach the full level of autonomy. As a matter of fact, you're being slow walked there today. Any car commercial that you see is talking about some assistive technology, assisted braking or adaptive cruise control. These are examples of technologies that are all part of autonomy. And so it's happening in front of you right this very minute. Ultimately, we expect there to be 4 types of vehicles, and one of them is the cars that you all probably drove to get here. Just normal cars that everybody drives. In addition, there will be cars that are fully autonomous or at a minimum partially autonomous. Those will be part of the ownership model. In other words, you would purchase one of these full-featured cars just like you would purchase the cars that you own today. Maybe the 2 most interesting types of vehicles, though, are the shared model. So this is similar to like a ride-sharing service, like an Uber or a Lyft today, except it is fully autonomous. Now, this is significant because, as we'll see in another slide, this is a dramatic shift in the cost of car ownership, total car ownership. And so in the shared model, I think we're familiar with, like Uber and Lyft being services, but don't be surprised if your Ford and your GMs end up actually being the primary providers of these services. And then what I think is really the most interesting one, and perhaps the most misunderstood and overlooked, is the pooled shared vehicles. So these vehicles represent what we believe to be the next phase of public transportation. So, often when we go to conferences and do presentations and workshops, people see this as a binary choice. Is this going to kill public transportation? I think it's quite the opposite. I think it will be, an amazing boon to public transportation. It's just going to be different than what we know it now. So the cost of car ownership today, roughly, in an average environment, it's about $10,000 a year for individual car ownership. So that breaks down into actually depreciation and ownership and insuring the car, maintenance on the car, fuel for the car, and paying for parking. So that's quite expensive, and that is somewhat agnostic of your income level. Obviously, if you have a more expensive car, your ownership levels go up. But across society, we have needs for transportation, and although depending on the income strata that you fall into, you're still going to have a significant transportation cost, especially in relation to your total income. The shared model, so this is a model that is, instead of owning a car, you summon a shared vehicle, much like you would summon a ride service today. That could possibly cut the cost of car ownership down as much as 50 to 70%. So that would be significant, especially for lower income populations where housing plus transportation cost often today run anywhere from 50 to 70% of someone's income, and we would consider that severely cost burden. So what do these crazy things look like? Well, they could look like this. They may not look like this, but they could look like this. So these are two examples of vehicles that are actually operating today. The one on the left is produced by General Motors, and the one on the right, I forget who makes that. Some fancy French company. But that's a miniature bus, and that's actually in operation today. And we've been doing these presentations for roughly 2 years, and the pace of change is happening so quickly that we often have to update these things on a weekly or bi-weekly basis because something else is being rolled out. That little bus, you're going to start to see things like this roving around places like Walt Disney World. These will be little automated transport buses that are replacing the larger buses. But they also have a significant impact for the future of public transportation, something that is a little bit more nimble like this. And so this is I hope this thing loads. This is really cool. So it might be a little difficult, but this is traffic at an intersection. And as you can see, the cars don't have to stop. Cars are just whizzing right through. And you're wondering, well, how can they do this? Well, the Columbus Smart Cities initiative is an example of deploying technology that will allow stuff like this to happen. So these are vehicles communicating with one another, vehicles communicating with infrastructure communicating back with the vehicles, and interacting with the environment around it. So, quite possibly, autonomy could conceivably eliminate the need for things like stop signs and traffic lights and all sorts of visual clutter.
Thanks, Rick. So unfortunately, that first video didn't load. We've taken a lot of the things out of this presentation to convince you this is going to happen, because essentially if you see that one video, then you're like, I get it, it's happening. So I would highly encourage you to just Google autonomous vehicle operation videos if you don't believe it when you leave. That particular one is from Tesla. It's over a year old, but there are countless other ones out there. One of the important things to think about, and this leads into this element of how things may change, is that when we start to get autonomous vehicles into the system, this isn't an all or nothing proposition. That last simulation we showed you, that would happen when all autonomous vehicles are working in harmony and there are no non-autonomous vehicles on the road. That's likely to be quite a few years out, decades likely. However, in the very near term, it's almost certain that we're going to have vehicles on the road that will be interacting with our traditional vehicles. Initial research is starting to show that even by a relatively low amount of adoption, we can start to see really high impacts. So for instance, with as low as 20% autonomous vehicles on the highways, the efficiency of highways goes up dramatically. And you say, well, why is that? If you've ever been driving down a highway and you've noticed that there are two trucks going at the exact same speed, blocking both lanes, making everyone go about 47 miles an hour, and you're furious, well, the reason they're doing that, theoretically, unless they're just two jerks, is that there is some kind of accident ahead, and they're regulating all the speeds. And so if they don't do that, what happens is everyone accordions up into a tiny little section, and then you have to wait to unaccordion that long line of cars. It's far more efficient to slow down gradually, go at a constant rate of speed, and then adapt to the road conditions. The idea of autonomous vehicles is you go slower to get there faster. And initial research is showing that with as little as 20% or fewer autonomous vehicles, that is what would happen on our highways. And as we'll show you here in just a second, there are a number of truck platooning and truck automated operations that are likely to start very soon. In addition, there's probably going to be a huge impact on parking, and that's what we'll get into now. So what we want to do is right now alert you to what we call change alerts, the things that show you this is an area that even when there aren't that many autonomous vehicles, these areas are probably going to dramatically change. That could be great for your community, or it could be bad if you don't plan for those. So one area is giant suburban strip malls and malls in general and retail stores with huge parking lots. If you have an area with a giant parking lot, you already have probably experienced in your city the fact that some of those stores have closed, or they're not doing as well as they used to, or that retail shifting. There's a dramatically shifting retail market that has nothing to do with autonomous vehicles. But autonomous vehicles are going to exacerbate that. And initial research now is showing that with 30% autonomous vehicles in the fleet, it could reduce parking needs at a place like a suburban shopping center by 90%. Why? Well, think about if you go to a shopping center, you don't want to park that far away from the store you're going to, right? Well, if your car drops you off at the front door, it can park wherever it wants to and come back and pick you up. And a lot of people won't even be driving their own cars. And that doesn't even count people who are just ordering everything on Amazon. You know, we used to joke about how, pretty much at any given moment we get in a car, we used to look for a highway sign that had something to do with hardware. Pretty soon we'll be able to get into a car and say, take me to a hardware store. Well, pretty soon I'll just be able to hold it in my hand and yell hammer. And then Amazon will drop one into my hand from a drone that's probably anticipating my move overhead. So retail is a huge transformational area and one that could really shift. Another thing is if you have a lot of unadaptable public investments. And what we mean by that is the really amazing thing about autonomous vehicles is that it will be using existing technology that is our roadway system. And so unlike other technologies where you have to build something new, we're just using what we already have. Unfortunately, some of the things we've built may not be adaptable. This is a picture of what we consider actually a very good-looking parking garage right by our office around the corner. And it cost over $20,000 a space to build. That's very typical for parking garages. The difficulty with this particular parking garage is almost all the parking is on a slope, it's on an angle, and the floor to ceiling ratio is very small, which is typical of garages. The problem is if this is no longer needed as a parking garage, it's really tough to adapt it to an apartment when you try to put a bathtub on a 14-degree slope. It doesn't tend to work out very well. So what we're advocating, and many cities are requiring, is that when you build something like this, it actually is adaptable if this technology needs reduce the need for overall parking. Now, this may be a perfectly placed garage because we may use this as a hive to charge parking after it drops you off at your nationwide insurance job or whatever it is for a period of 10 to 15 to 20 years. But what we have to think about is as we're bonding these for 20 and 30 years as communities, will we be getting the parking resources at the end of the day to pay these off, or do we have an albatross on our hands that we then have to demolish to change? And then a third change alert, as we like to say, is this idea of having no worthy sense of place. That's a planner word, but basically it's a big, junky nowheresville where everything looks the same because you will have no incentive to go there if your incentive of ease is taken away. The only reason that we go to eat at whatever restaurant it is that's surrounded by a bunch of parking that's right off the freeway interchange is because it's super easy and we don't have to worry about fighting traffic and figuring out how to get there. As soon as all those problems are eliminated and we're not doing the driving, then we will want to go to a place where we can get out and actually enjoy the place where we are instead of a place like that. And so what we did is we took, just as a sample, we're not picking on Crosswoods, so if anybody in here developed Crosswoods, we apologize. But Crosswoods is what we like to call a mix of uses. It's not mixed use because everything is next to each other, but it's a whole bunch of different kinds of uses. And obviously here right north of 270 near Worthington. So 350 acres is the overall amount of ground that's in Crosswoods. And only 4% of that is roadway access. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. So all of us get in and out on just that little tiny bit of public roadway. And then we have buildings. Now here's the really amazing part, and this is not atypical. This is a very typical development pattern in the United States and in many places around the world. Only 9% of all that ground is building. So all of the things we think we need, you're like, well, why is that? Well, the reason is because we need to get people physically there and out of there while they have their cars. So we do have quite a bit of what we call green space. Really, a lot of this is stormwater control and just setbacks and other things zonings require. But 55% of that, 192 acres, is parking. You know, as a means of comparison, that's a couple arena districts. That's the whole core of downtown. It's all parking lots. And that's just one individual example around the entire outer belt. Now, contemplate what happens if, not that far down the road, say 15 years from now, we have 25% to 30% autonomous vehicles in our fleet, and 90% of this parking is reduced. What do we do with this? As individual cities, as a region, we don't know how we're going to transition this because we don't have enough people. We're very fortunate in Central Ohio. We have between 500,000 and 1 million people predicted to be here by 2050. An additional 500,000 to 1 million. So that would bring us up to a really significant population for the region. Pittsburgh is flat. Cleveland is flat. All these other cities have flat population. If all of a sudden you bring thousands of acres online for potential redevelopment without any new people, we have to make decisions on what we're going to do with all that land. And it could have enormous impacts, both on our physical structure of cities, but also on the economic makeup of the way that real estate transactions happen. I'm going to let Rick talk about his study here.
So when I introduced myself, I said I fancy myself a little bit of a nerd, and here's where I'm going to unleash some nerddom on you. So I work a lot with geographic information systems, which is kind of a fancy way of saying I work a lot with maps that can crunch a lot of numbers within those maps. And so we were really interested in seeing, can we model what the potential impact is on land value and land uses, and therefore use those as proxies for the impact on the economy as a whole. There's an old adage in real estate, right, that they're not making any more of it. But what's interesting about this is it's kind of turning that on its head. It's going to free up real estate that was previously occupied. Now, when I do my modeling, I am generally very, very conservative. As a matter of fact, within the first 6 months of us doing this modeling, I had to revise the models 3 times because I was too conservative. Literally, the things that I was assuming were going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years were kind of already happening. And so I had to revise the models. So we used GIS. This is Franklin County. And it might be a little difficult to see where you're at, but the reds and the oranges represent the places where those commercial uses are going to be the most disrupted. So we expect to see the biggest changes in land use and land valuation. So literally, you can interpret this as saying, this is where we are creating more real estate, where it was generally occupied by primarily parking, but not entirely by parking. There's quite a few variables that go into this model. It is a parcel-based model that it includes a lot of economic and demographic data. The next step beyond this is and it's actually what we're going to be doing for a workshop we're doing in Portland, Oregon here in a couple months. But the next step beyond this is to try to attempt what that economic impact is and try to put that into real world numbers. So we did a presentation for the American Planning Association. It was a webinar, a national webinar. So we also included some other regions, and we looked at something like Atlanta. And Atlanta is extremely spread out, and the commercial impact is actually slightly greater than it is in terms of percentage of overall space than it is to the metro region of Columbus, and by and large because it is so very spread out. And so the areas in green represent the areas of the smallest impact on the commercial built environment. So this presents an awful lot of questions. is traffic going to get better or worse? Are we going to see more or less sprawl? And what happens to public transportation? What about pedestrians? And how does this affect our neighborhoods? So we got a little bit of time left, and we're going to try to get through and present some of the answers, or the way we speculate as what we believe will happen in these scenarios. Will traffic get better or worse? Well, there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is it'll get much worse, because you're going to induce more trips. You're reducing the cost to such a degree that you induce trips. Think about it like modern highway expansion. There really aren't very many examples of building more lanes and it actually reducing the amount of traffic. It actually induces more traffic. More development comes to fill up that empty space, and more people are inclined to use those new lanes where in the past they may have avoided a trip throughout a certain time of day because of traffic. But then, if we have some degree of ordered autonomy, full autonomy, it could greatly reduce the amount of, not of traffic, but the congestion, if you will. Because these cars, these automated vehicles, they can fit closer together. They can talk to one another. They can behave in a rational fashion, not like today. It's interesting that we were giving this presentation today when a lot of ice and snow on the ground, and we got some questions before we even started. How will these things operate on the ice and snow? And my answer was, well, probably better than humans do. But ice is still ice, and several inches of snow is still several inches of snow. But I like to think that they would operate at a normal, safe operating speed. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to sprawl? Well, again, this could end up being heaven or the opposite. It could encourage or induce sprawl to exceed today's exurban fringe, because you no longer really have that constraint placed upon yourself of driving. You can actually you can live out an hour or so away and sit in that car and enjoy the ride to work, or maybe even work while you're on your way to work. I tend to think that that's not quite likely, because I posit that we still only have 24 hours in a day, and time is still a limitation. And being in an automated vehicle or being in any vehicle, you're still in that vehicle and not somewhere else, not somewhere presumably where you would rather be. But it could quite possibly affect the density. We can, and this could go either way too. We can do a lot more with less, or we can allow it to, to again, even result in greater sprawl and spill out over the landscape. One of the things I mentioned when we started is it's really up to us, to rein this stuff in and set the agenda and put forth these policies and have an idea of what we want our world to look like, and then build towards that and not be slaves to the technology itself.
So just a couple other things. We talked earlier about truck platooning. This is an example of a technology that is going to be tested right now, right this minute in Columbus. They're working on it both on 33 North and South in two separate projects. Truck platooning is a system by which the rear truck links up to the front truck by radio frequency ID, and the rear trucker takes his hands and his feet off the wheel, and it just follows the first truck. Uber has just released a plan where they want to have intra-city driverless trucking within the next 5 years. What would happen is there would be a hub in each city. Their truck would leave that hub that's right near the freeway. It would drive with no driver all the way across the country to another hub, unload inside that warehouse where then human drivers would take over. What we're going to see is companies rapidly adapting the ways to fit this technology as it works now into our system and save themselves a ton of money. So as we always say, it's a really bad time to be a truck driver, but it's a great time to own a trucking company. And that is an indicative element of how this economy is going to shift. And we'll talk about some of those other shifts in a second. What about bikers and pedestrians? We don't know. We don't know. Bikers seem to be much more in favor of this. City of Pittsburgh now has, is it 8, I think? 8 different companies that are testing on-street vehicles that are fully autonomous. Bike community was very against it. After a little bit of testing, they seem to find that it's actually much safer for you to be a biker next to an autonomous vehicle. The chance of getting hit is relatively lower. The difficulty is what happens if we start to eliminate stop signs at our freeway or our intersections and streetlights. What happens if pedestrians start bullying all of the cars because we can jump out in front and they can't hit us? We don't know. It's a whole other set of things we need to contemplate. What about transit? We talked about this a little bit. We're all speculating. There's a wide variety of thought on this. My personal thought is I think this could be a great way to solve what we call that first mile, last mile problem, where it's tough to get people to different modes, and maybe this will revitalize things like intracity rail, or maybe it won't because the highways will be so efficient. Whatever happens, it's going to have to be a collaborative effort between autonomy and whatever it is that's going on, and we're just starting to look at those things now. So one thing I want you to think about as we, one final thing before we wrap up. How are our neighborhoods going to change? This is just a typical near inner ring suburb, this is Grandview, and there's a ton of on-street parking. Even though people do have garages, they park on the street. What happens when we don't need any of that on-street parking? Do we keep paving it and spending that money? Do we make it stormwater gardens? Do we let kids just play in the streets again like they used to tons and many, many years ago? Well, I don't know. But these are all things that could change pretty rapidly once cars can no longer strike a person with any ease. And on that note, just a couple quick things to think about. So one of the giant changes that are going to take place, the reason why this is so important to the federal government is that 40,000 people died in car crashes in the United States last year. That's a sharp rise from a few years ago. Used to be at about those levels. Then we invented things like airbags and anti-lock brakes, and it kept going down and down. And then we invented something else that's called the cell phone, and it all went back up. So we are at the highest levels that we've been at since the 60s of deaths, and that includes about 1 million people worldwide estimated. The estimate for autonomous vehicles is that they will prevent 95+% of all accidents. So then that brings up all kinds of things. We won't have any more traffic tickets. We won't have any more insurance individually for our cars. We won't have any more organ donation from young people getting killed in car crashes. There's sort of an infinite number of things to think about. So what we're hoping that you do is kind of go home and think about all the different weird ways that your life would change in the life around you if you no longer were driving. And what we're going to ask you to do is think about helping us to advocate to people that you have to pay attention to this. It's not that you have to tell them they need to get an autonomous vehicle or what they're driving now doesn't work anymore or everything's going to go away. But it's vital that as leaders in our community, you impress upon your councils and your mayors and your civic leaders and business leaders that there's a fundamental shift that is coming and they have to be ready to respond to make our region stronger. And I can assure you, those in those industries I just mentioned are following this very closely and are very concerned with the way those things are going to happen. So again, I apologize for that first video not working. I hope you do take a moment to Google one of the autonomous vehicle test videos because I think it will very much impress you. And I have had the opportunity to ride an autonomous vehicle, and guess what? It's actually kind of boring. And that's probably the most significant news about it, because if it was scary and like a roller coaster and I was holding on to the edge of my seat the whole time, I would be a little more concerned about it catching on. But after a few minutes, it was just like somebody driving me around the city streets of Pittsburgh, and it was just kind of boring. So I think that's what's going to happen, and all of us are going to get used to it very quickly. And before you know it, it's just going to be a part of your daily life, and it will start to affect the way that you make decisions. So with that, we'd like to turn it over to some questions. We've got, I believe, 8 minutes to take questions. Yeah, sure.
I saw a study in Governing magazine. A lot of cities, especially smaller cities, make most of their revenue out of parking meters and parking fines, and that's all going to go away with this.
Yeah. One of the big talks at the APA National Symposium that we attended a few months ago was the notion of demand pricing for vehicles. Right now, all of the new vehicles that are produced have some sort of GPS abilities that you don't always turn on your GPS or subscribe to it, but all the vehicles have that. And again, this is part of, we're already getting tracked by the cell phones in our pocket, but as far as these autonomous vehicles, they basically can track how many people are in the car, if you're going at a high demand time, and we may have to look for ways to replace revenue by charging people a per mile cost that gets baked into the overall transportation.
So his question was about, the loss of revenue from parking tickets and speeding tickets and whatnot. And I would argue that we don't adequately or we don't represent the true cost of driving correctly today anyway. And that is just one small example of funding something that should actually be funded in a different manner. If we treated transportation more like a utility, I think we'd get a lot closer to that funding structure that we really need to get to. And so something like congestion pricing, to me, I think that's almost inevitable. And to avoid some of the things that we warn about in the future, perhaps we're looking at something like that, not just to kind of force the funding model, force a change in the funding model, but ultimately force a change in human behavior, because we know we can do this. We know we can induce changes in human behavior that result in a more efficient system. Next.
What's the thinking about how this will affect intermodal freight? Will there be a need for railroad in the middle of the transportation?
So the question was about the impact on intermodal freight, specifically rail in this example. I think automation is going to fundamentally change a lot of parts of that chain. And so, from the loading and the unloading to the transportation part, I don't see rail being made obsolete, at least not in the next decade or so. I expect it to be around. That said, there could be something that supplants automated vehicles. I know we were all told, at least I was told, that we would have flying jetpacks and cars by now. But we might actually have flying jetpacks and cars. So I would say in the near term, and in this case I would characterize the near term as the 10 to 15, even 20 years. I see it being complementary in nature. I don't see it replacing it. But then again, we could wake up tomorrow morning and somebody's invented some sort of rocket that takes care of all that. I know you had your hand up.
So when we think about your presentation today, kind of geared toward Columbus and Atlanta, the corollary for a population center like Boston that's highly dense, isn't that just going to make them more efficient than they are now with their public transportation? So
the question was, we talked about Columbus and Atlanta. Well, how does this impact a denser city like a Boston? Maybe the best example, modern day example we can look to is what's going on in New York City today. So, the rise of these services has really put a burden on the road network in Manhattan and greater New York City. And at the same time, the subway line is failing. So everything's kind of coming together at the same time.
But for a lot of reasons.
Reasons not related to. Right. To this, yes, but if Bloomberg, former Bloomberg is he's advocating for strict policy changes, deciding exactly how much traffic do you want, and then dealing with it with congestion pricing. I mean, he has put all his chips in towards changing human behaviors. So
that being said, just real quickly, just to kind of put a big button on that, if you look at our whole country, we don't really have that many areas that truly have that true density, and that is a different issue. In reality, we have a lot more cities like Atlanta and Columbus, and even cities throughout California. There's San Francisco, that's great. Then you got Sacramento, and you've got Los Angeles. So that is a different problem, and maybe it helps. But either way, there's going to be a giant sea change in 95% of the country. So yeah, somebody here, let's take a different part of the room. So somebody way in the back.
Right there.
Okay, first of all, this is the second presentation that I've been to by you all.
Okay.
And I am on board. The first one I was like, meh, but I am on board and I think it's going to be a great thing. Having said that, I live in the suburbs, but my heart is on the farm. So what's it going to do to agribusiness?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of folks in the rural areas are actually very excited because the business side of it, we'll take in a second, but first, just from the transportation side, counties spend an inordinate amount of money transporting people around in areas that don't have any kind of real secondary transportation network. So we think that's going to be a huge asset for the people that live in and around rural areas. As for business, actually a lot of this is getting used already. I grew up in a farming community, and we always envied. I worked on the golf course, and we were outside sweating, which sounds like, some luxurious job on the golf course. And then, meanwhile, the kid who worked for the farm next door was in this air-conditioned cab, listening to, Journey and whatever other music was in 1980, whatever. And we're like, we should have done that. So anyway, the point is, a lot of these tractors are already kind of outfitted with much of this technology now. So I think it's going to help. I don't see where this has any way it hurts the actual business model of running the farm. But as Rick said, this is going to transform the way that goods and services move around the country, and I can't speak to how that's going to work. That's just too sure, and that could be a benefit, but it might not be. So another question, sure, right next there.
Driving for leisure, pleasure, motorcycles.
Yep.
Where does that fall?
Well, people are still going to do it for as long as they can, and I would anticipate it'll be many decades before it's outlawed per se. That being said, as our friend Justin, who presents with us, likes to say, people still like to ride horses too. We all used to ride horses everywhere. Now, if you want to ride a horse, you have to have a specific way and a place to do it. I would imagine that urban cores are going to be the first to ban you driving your own car, traditional cars. But that's going to be a place like Manhattan. And it's going to be a place like the core of Boston. I mean, they already have pricing for Center City, Paris, where you can only come in on certain days depending on your license plate and all those types of things. So I think it'll first happen in really dense urban areas, then it'll happen at a wider scale. Then maybe 50, 60 years from now, most people will probably go to a special place to drive their own car that will be outside of where we are now. Now, a state like Montana, maybe that'll always be wide open for driving, just like a lot of people ride horses there. That's our speculation, but again, pure speculation. We had one over here?
How do you guard against hackers bringing everything to a dead stop?
This was one of our favorite questions to avoid for the longest time. The question was, how do you, it was a security question, how you avoid hackers. And then if you've paid attention, you literally cannot watch, any business television or read the news without hearing something about cryptocurrency or the blockchain. And so you don't have to know anything about either of these things other than the blockchain is this really secure platform that kind of lays on top of an existing network, and in this case it's the internet. I used to think that these things were going to operate on a separate network, like we have the internet and then we have CardNet that you need special access to. I am becoming convinced that it will be some derivative of blockchain technology. And so we don't have nearly enough time to get into blockchain technology. But that is an extremely secure way of everybody that is part of this ledger system all agreeing that a transaction is taking place. In cryptocurrency, that is exchange of one Bitcoin to another person. But in this world, it would be, is this car legit? Is this car legit? I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to let you do this. And this happens like that. And across thousands and thousands of distributed ledgers, they all agree that that is allowed to take place. And that's what nano computing and Moore's law will facilitate. Do we have time for?
That's it. Yeah, Rick, thank you. We'll see you all again January 22nd, and we're going to have a great program on how the opiate crisis is impacting Central Ohio and Columbus. So we'll see you then.